At 53, Eleanor Whitman had been called many things by the matchmaking agencies of Boston, too set in her ways, too particular, too old. But she had never been called desperate, until now, standing on the dusty platform of Copper Creek, station in Wyoming Territory, clutching a worn leather satchel and a letter that promised her a new life with a man who'd chosen her photograph from among dozens of younger, prettier faces. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September sun beat down mercilessly as Eleanor stepped off the Union Pacific train, her dark wool traveling dress already clinging uncomfortably to her frame. Around her, the other passengers hurried toward waiting carriages and familiar faces, while she stood alone, scanning the small crowd for a man she'd never met, but had agreed to marry. 3 months earlier, life had been predictable in her narrow, a brownstone on Marlborough Street. Eleanor had spent her days managing the household accounts for wealthy Boston families, her evenings reading by lamplight, and her Sundays attending services at Trinity Church. At 25, she'd married Robert Whitman, a kind but sickly clerk who died of consumption just 4 years later. For the next 24 years, she'd worn her widow's weeds with dignity, declining the occasional suitor who found her competent management skills more appealing than her fading beauty. But Boston had grown expensive, and the families who'd once relied on her services had begun hiring younger women with modern ideas about household management. The inheritance from Robert's modest estate had dwindled, and Eleanor faced the prospect of moving to a boarding house or seeking employment as a common servant. Neither option suited a woman who'd grown accustomed to independence. The advertisement in the Boston Herald had been small, tucked between notices for patent medicines and farm equipment. Widowed rancher in Wyoming Territory seeks mature woman for companionship and marriage. Must be of good character and sound health. Age is no barrier for the right disposition. Eleanor had read it 3 times before setting down her morning coffee. Most marriage advertisements specified youth and beauty as requirements. This one asked for character and health, qualities she possessed in abundance, even if her mirror no longer reflected the fresh-faced girl who'd once turned heads on Commonwealth Avenue. She'd written carefully, describing herself honestly. A widow of 24 years, experienced in household management, well-read though not formally educated, of Methodist upbringing but tolerant of other faiths. She'd included a recent photograph, taken at a studio on Washington Street, where the photographer had captured her steady gaze and the silver threads in her auburn hair without attempting to flatter. The response had come within 2 weeks. James McKinnon of the Circle M Ranch wrote in a clear, educated hand that he was 38 years old, 15 years her junior, and had been widowed for 3 years. His first wife, Mary Catherine, had died in childbirth along with their son. He managed a cattle operation spanning 12,000 acres, employed 8 men year-round, and lived in a house he'd built himself from local stone and timber. I believe, he'd written, that partnership matters more than passion, and wisdom more than youth. If you're prepared for the isolation and harsh beauty of this country, I believe we might suit each other well. His photograph showed a lean man with dark hair and serious eyes, his face weathered by sun and wind. He looked like someone who kept his word. Now, standing in the dust and heat of Copper Creek, Eleanor wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The town consisted of little more than a dozen wooden buildings stretched along a single street, with the train station serving as the grandest structure in sight. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the warm weather, and the vast emptiness of the landscape made her feel suddenly small and out of place. Mrs. Whitman, She turned to find a tall man approaching, hat in hand. This wasn't the face from the photograph. This man was older, with greying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "I'm Thomas McKinnon," he said, extending his hand. "James sent me to collect you. I'm his foreman and his friend. He's dealing with a situation at the ranch. Nothing serious, but cattle don't wait for convenient timing." Eleanor shook his hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work. "Mr. McKinnon, I hope there's no trouble. Just a fence down near the north pasture. He'll be back by evening." Thomas gestured toward a sturdy wagon hitched to two patient horses. "It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. I hope you don't mind the dust." As they loaded her trunk and satchels into the wagon, Thomas kept up a steady stream of conversation that helped ease her nervousness. He'd worked for James for 5 years, he explained, and had known Mary Catherine as well. The ranch was prosperous, the crew reliable, and James a fair employer who paid well and treated his men with respect. "He's a good man," Thomas said as they left the town behind, following a rutted track across rolling grassland. "Took Mary Catherine's death hard. Blamed himself, though there was nothing he could have done. Doctor said she was too small built for bearing children, but James couldn't. He passed his own guilt." The landscape gradually transformed as they traveled. What had seemed like empty wasteland from the train station revealed itself as complex terrain, dotted with cattle, cut by streams, and bordered by stands of cottonwood and aspen. Hawks circled overhead, and Eleanor spotted deer grazing in the distance, their heads lifting alertly as the wagon passed. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. The scale of the country was overwhelming, but there was something magnificent in its vastness, something that made her feel both insignificant and strangely free. "Winter's another story," Thomas warned. "Snow can pile 6 feet deep, and the wind cuts through you like a knife. But spring comes eventually, and there's nothing prettier than this country when the wildflowers bloom." They crested a hill, and the Circle M ranch spread out below them. The house was larger than Eleanor had expected, built of local stone with a wide porch wrapped around 3 sides. Corrals and outbuildings were arranged with practical efficiency, and she could see men working with horses in a fenced area near the barn. Everything looked solid, well-maintained and permanent. "James built most of it himself," Thomas said, pride evident in his voice. "Took him 4 years to get it the way he wanted. Mary Catherine helped with the planning, chose the spot for the house and the layout of the kitchen garden." As they approached the house, a woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40, with greying brown hair pulled back severely and sharp blue eyes that assessed Eleanor with frank curiosity. "This is Martha Hendricks," Thomas said. "She keeps house for James and feeds the crew." "Martha, this is Mrs. Whitman." Martha's handshake was firm, her manner direct. "Welcome to Wyoming. I hope you're prepared for hard living. This isn't Boston." The slight edge in her voice suggested she'd formed opinions about city women who answered marriage advertisements. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "I've managed households for 24 years, Mrs. Hendricks. I may not know cattle ranching, but I understand hard work." Something in Martha's expression shifted, respect replacing skepticism. "We'll see. Come on, I'll show you to your room. James thought you might want time to settle in before he gets back." The house's interior was simpler than Eleanor had expected, but well appointed. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, comfortable furniture built from local wood, and windows that framed the spectacular mountain views. Martha led her upstairs to a spacious bedroom with its own sitting area, clearly the best guest room in the house. "This was going to be the nursery," Martha said quietly. "James had me prepare it for you instead." Left alone, Eleanor unpacked, her belongings hanging her few good dresses in the cedar wardrobe and arranging her books on a small shelf near the window. The room smelled of pine and lavender, and afternoon light streamed through curtains that looked hand-sewn. She touched the quilt on the bed, wedding ring pattern, beautifully crafted, and wondered if Mary Catherine had made it. From her window she could see the ranch spreading in all directions, cattle grazing peacefully in nearby pastures, men going about their work with quiet efficiency. It was so different from the crowded streets and narrow spaces of Boston that she felt dizzy with the change. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Martha stood in the hallway, holding a tray with coffee and fresh bread. "Thought you might. Be hungry. Dinner's at 6 when the men come in." "Thank you," Eleanor accepted the tray gratefully. "Mrs. Hendricks, may I ask you something?" "Martha." "And ask away. What do you think of this arrangement, honestly?" Martha studied her for a long moment. "I think James is lonelier than he admits, and too proud to court properly. I think he's tired of eating meals in silence and coming home to an empty house. As for you," she paused, "I think you're either very brave or very foolish, and I haven't decided which yet. Perhaps both. Perhaps." Martha's smile was grudging but genuine. "We'll find out soon enough." The sound of hoofbeats on packed dirt brought Eleanor to her window as the sun began its descent behind the western mountains. A lone rider approached the house at an easy lope, his silhouette becoming clearer as he drew near. Even from a distance, she could see this was James McKinnon, taller than his foreman, sitting on his horse with the easy confidence of a man born to the saddle. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched him dismount near the front porch, speaking briefly to one of the ranch hands who'd come to take his horse. In the golden evening light, she could make out the lean build described in his letters, the dark hair now revealed to be streaked with premature silver at the temples. He moved with deliberate precision, his gestures economical and purposeful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Martha's voice carried up from the kitchen, calling the men to supper. Eleanor smoothed her best blue dress, the one that brought out her eyes, according to her Boston seamstress, and checked her reflection one final time. The mirror showed a woman who looked her age, but carried it well. Silver hair arranged in a neat chignon, laugh lines that spoke of a life lived with humor despite its sorrows. The dining room buzzed with quiet conversation when she descended the stairs. 8 men sat around a long oak table, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their manner respectful but curious as she entered. They rose as one when she appeared, hats coming off heads, in a gesture that spoke of ingrained courtesy. James stood at the head of the table, and their eyes met across the room. His photograph hadn't captured the intelligence in his dark gaze, or the way one corner of his mouth quirked upward in what might have been amusement or nervousness. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, but more than that, he looked solid. The kind of man who kept his promises and paid his debts. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, his voice deeper than she'd expected, carrying the slight drawl of someone who'd spent time in Texas. "Welcome to Circle M, Mr. McKinnon." She moved forward, extending her hand. "Thank you for inviting me into your home." His grip was firm, calloused from rope and reins, and he held her gaze steadily as they shook hands. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. Thomas made it very pleasant. Your ranch is beautiful." "Supper's getting cold," Martha announced from the kitchen doorway, though her tone carried affection rather than impatience. James gestured toward the chair to his right. "Will you join us? The men are curious to meet the lady brave enough to venture this far from civilization." The crew introduced themselves as they took their seats. Charlie Moss, the oldest at 62, who'd been working cattle since before the war between the states. Ben Rodriguez, whose family had ranched in Texas for 3 generations. Young Pete Sullivan, barely 18 and eager to prove himself. And others whose names and faces blurred together in Eleanor's nervousness. They were a mixed group. Some American-born, others immigrants from Ireland and Germany, but united by their obvious loyalty to James and their competence in their work. Martha served thick steaks, mashed potatoes, green beans from her kitchen garden, and biscuits that put Boston bakeries to shame. The conversation flowed easily around topics Eleanor knew nothing about: cattle prices, weather patterns, the condition of various pastures. But she found herself drawn into the rhythm of their exchanges, the way they teased each other with the familiarity of men who'd worked together through good times and bad. "Mrs. Whitman," Charlie said during a lull in the conversation, "Thomas tells me you're from Boston. That's a far piece from Wyoming." "It is indeed, but I found that sometimes distance is exactly what a person needs." "What did you do back there?" Ben asked. "If you don't mind my asking." "I managed households for several families, oversaw staff, balanced accounts, organized social events. I suppose you could call me a professional organizer, though that wasn't a common term then." Pete looked puzzled. "Rich folks need someone to tell them how to run their own houses." Eleanor smiled at his genuine confusion. "You'd be surprised how complicated it becomes when you have 15 servants, 3 houses, and a social calendar that requires coordinating with dozens of other families. It's rather like managing a small business." "Sounds like you'd understand ranch bookkeeping," James said quietly. "We run a complex operation here. Breeding records, feed costs, market timing, payroll for seasonal workers. It's more involved than most people realize. I'd be interested to learn about it." The words came out before she could stop them, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd spoken too boldly, assuming a role in his business that he might not want her to fill, but James nodded approvingly. "I'd appreciate an extra set of eyes on the books. Running cattle and managing paperwork don't always go together naturally." After supper, the men dispersed to evening chores or the bunkhouse, their thanks to Martha for the meal echoing across the yard. James lingered, helping to clear the table despite Martha's protests. "Walk with me?" he asked Eleanor as the housekeeper bustled away with the last of the dishes. "I'd like to show you around properly." The evening air carried the scent of hay and horses, cooling quickly as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. James led her to the front porch, where they settled into wooden chairs that faced west toward the spectacular sunset, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "It's magnificent," Eleanor said softly. "I never imagined sunsets could be so vivid. Mary Catherine used to say the same thing." James's voice carried no pain, just quiet remembrance. She was from Kansas originally, prairie country, but she'd never seen mountains before she came here. "Tell me about her." The request surprised them both, but Eleanor had learned that avoiding difficult topics only made them loom larger. James was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, careful. "She was young when we married, 22 to my 31, sweet-natured, eager to please, excited about everything. She loved this place immediately, started planning improvements before she'd even unpacked her trunk." He paused, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "She wanted children desperately. We both did, but each pregnancy ended in loss until the last one, when she—" He stopped, unable to finish. "I'm sorry, that must have been devastating. I blamed myself for years, still do sometimes. She was so small, so delicate. Maybe if I'd been more careful, more protective." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "In my experience, we rarely have as much control over life and death as we imagine. Sometimes terrible things happen despite our best efforts." He turned to look at her then, really look, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You speak like someone who's known loss. My husband died young, consumption. I spent 2 years nursing him, trying every cure, every treatment. In the end, nothing I did made a difference." She smoothed her skirt, remembering. "For a long time, I wondered if I could have done more, tried harder, been better somehow. but grief has a way of teaching perspective eventually. Eventually, James agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Why did you answer my advertisement?" he asked suddenly. "A woman with your experience could have found work in Boston, married well if she'd chosen to. Why come here?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. She could give him practical reasons: the economy, the changing job market, her dwindling savings, but something in his directness deserved honesty in return. "Because I was disappearing," she said finally. "In Boston, I'd become invisible, the competent widow who managed other people's lives while having none of her own. When younger women began taking the positions I'd held, I realized I'd spent 24 years being useful to others without ever being essential to anyone." James leaned forward, his attention focused entirely on her. "And you thought marriage to a stranger would change that?" "I thought it might give me a chance to matter again, to build something with someone rather than simply maintaining what others had created." She met his gaze directly. "I know what people in town probably said about me. Too old, too set in my ways, desperate enough to travel halfway across the continent for a husband. Maybe they're right, but I'd rather be here, taking a chance on something new, than sitting in my parlor in Boston, growing older and smaller every day. You don't seem small to me." The simple statement carried weight, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Your letter mentioned partnership," she said. "What did you mean by that?" James stretched his legs out in front of him, considering. "I meant that I'm not looking for someone to simply keep house and bear children. I've got Martha for the first. And the second," he shrugged. "At 38, with the life I lead, I'm more interested in companionship than romance. Someone to share decisions with, to talk through problems, to make this place feel less empty." "That sounds practical rather than romantic. Is that a criticism?" Eleanor surprised herself by laughing. "Quite the opposite. Romance is for young people who have time to waste on misunderstandings and dramatic gestures. I'm much more interested in compatibility and mutual respect." "Good." James stood, extending his hand to help her up. "Because I have a proposition for you." Inside the house, he led her to a small office off the main room, where a roll-top desk overflowed with papers, ledger books, and correspondence. Maps of the ranch covered one wall, marked with notes about grazing rotations and water sources. "This is where I try to keep track of everything," he said, gesturing to the organized chaos. "Breeding records, market reports, supply orders, payroll. It's gotten beyond what one person can handle efficiently." He pulled out a thick ledger and opened it to pages covered with his careful handwriting. "We run about 3,000 head of cattle across 12,000 acres. Spring calving season alone generates enough paperwork to bury a man. Then there's the seasonal crew to coordinate, the hay contracts, the railroad shipping schedules." Eleanor studied the entries, recognizing the systematic approach, even if the subject matter was foreign. "You're very thorough." "I have to be. One mistake in breeding records or market timing can cost thousands of dollars." He closed the book and faced her directly. "I'd like you to take over the business side of the operation. Full partnership in decisions that affect the ranch's finances and future." The offer took her breath away. "You hardly know me. I know you managed multiple households successfully for 24 years. I know you're intelligent enough to learn, quickly and honest enough to admit when you don't understand something. Most importantly, I know you're not here because you have no other choices. You're here because you chose to be." "What about the other aspects of marriage?" The question came out more boldly than she'd intended. James's smile was gentle but direct. "We're both adults, Eleanor. We can approach that subject as we do everything else, with honesty and patience. No expectations, no pressure. We'll see what develops naturally." The use of her first name sent a small thrill through her. In Boston, even close friends maintained formal address. Here, apparently, directness was valued over propriety. "There's something else," James continued. "The town council wants to establish a school in Copper Creek. They need someone educated and experienced to serve as the first teacher. The position comes with a small salary and considerable respect in the community. You're offering me work. Beyond the ranch, I'm offering you the chance to be essential in more ways than one. The children in this area deserve better than the sporadic lessons they get now from whoever's available. You could build something lasting." Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the ranch buildings silhouetted against the star-filled sky. In Boston, her life had been circumscribed by others' expectations and needs. Here, James was offering her the chance to shape not just a household, but a community's future. "I accept," she said, turning back to face him. "The partnership, the books, all of it." "Even without knowing what winter's like here, without understanding how isolated we'll be for months at a time?" "Especially because of that." She smiled, feeling more certain than she had in years. "I'm tired of small spaces and smaller expectations. If I'm going to take risks, I might as well take large ones." James extended his hand, and they shook on it, a business arrangement between equals, sealed with mutual respect and cautious optimism. "Welcome to the Circle M, partner," he said. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its voice rising and falling across the vast landscape. For the first time in decades, Eleanor felt like she was exactly where she belonged, 3 weeks into. October. Eleanor discovered that managing a cattle ranch required skills no Boston finishing school had ever taught. She stood in James's office at dawn, wearing a practical wool dress and sturdy boots Martha had procured from the general store, studying breeding charts while James prepared for the day's work. "The Hereford bull in Section 12 needs to be moved before winter," she said, tracing her finger across the map. "According to these records, he's been with the same group of cows for 6 weeks. Isn't that longer than optimal?" James looked up from checking his rifle, surprise and approval mixing in his expression. "You've been studying the breeding manuals?" "All week. Fascinating reading, actually, much more scientific than I expected." She pulled out a ledger filled with her careful notes. "I've been calculating gestation periods and tracking bloodlines. If we move Thunder, that's the bull, to Section 15, we could improve the genetic diversity of next spring's calves by approximately 12%. "Thunder?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "The men told me his registered name is Copper Creek Thunderstorm. Thunder seemed more practical for daily use." James's laugh was warm and genuine. "Thunder it is, and you're absolutely right about moving him. I've been so focused on the immediate work that I haven't been thinking strategically about breeding rotations." The easy acceptance of her contribution filled Eleanor with satisfaction she hadn't felt since her early days managing the Pemberton household in Boston. Here, her organizational skills translated directly into improved efficiency and profit. "There's something else," she said, pulling out another set of papers. "I've been corresponding with cattle buyers in Denver and Chicago. The prices they're offering for spring delivery are 15% higher than what you received last year, but only if we can guarantee specific weights and grades." James set down his rifle and gave her his full attention. "What kind of guarantees?" "Minimum weight of 1,100 pounds per head, with less than a quarter-inch of back fat. The buyers want leaner beef, but they're willing to pay premium prices for it." She showed him the letters she'd received. "I took the liberty of requesting detailed specifications. If we adjust the feeding program over the winter and select only our best breeding stock, we could meet their requirements. That would mean culling some of our older cows and investing in better feed. Initial cost of approximately $800, With projected additional profit of $3,000 come spring, Eleanor had learned to speak in concrete numbers. Ranch decisions, she'd discovered, were always about balancing risk against potential reward. James studied her calculations, his brow furrowed in concentration. These figures assume we don't lose cattle over the winter. I factored in a 10% loss rate based on your records from the past 5 years. Even with that cushion, the profit margin remains substantial. You've been busy. I've been useful. The distinction mattered to her. In Boston, she'd been busy with endless social obligations that meant nothing. Here, every hour spent studying cattle breeding or market reports contributed directly to their shared future. A knock on the door interrupted their discussion. Thomas entered, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious concern. "We've got trouble." "In town," he said without preamble. "Pete rode back from Copper Creek with news. Seems the Brennan family is causing problems about the school." Eleanor had spent the previous week in town, meeting with the school committee and assessing the space that would serve as Copper Creek's first official classroom. The enthusiasm of the parents had been encouraging, but she'd sensed undercurrents of tension she hadn't fully understood. "What kind of problems?" James asked. "Patrick Brennan's been telling anyone who'll listen that hiring a mail-order bride to teach their children is scandalous. Says it sets a bad example, having an unmarried woman living in sin with the town's most eligible bachelor." The crude language hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She'd known there would be gossip about their arrangement, but she'd underestimated the viciousness of small-town judgment. "We're engaged," James said flatly. "Anyone with questions about our situation can speak to me directly." "That's not the worst of it," Thomas continued reluctantly. "Brennan's stirring up sentiment against Mrs. Whitman teaching at all. Says a woman her age with no children of her own can't possibly understand what's best for young minds. He's got some of the other fathers nodding along." Eleanor sank into the chair behind the desk, the weight of familiar disappointment settling on her shoulders. Once again, her age and unmarried status were being used to dismiss her qualifications. "And character, how many families are we talking about?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Hard to say. Brennan's got a loud voice, but not everyone's listening. The Johnsons are solidly behind you, and so are the Kowalskis. Mrs. Patterson told him off publicly yesterday, said any woman smart enough to manage a ranch operation was certainly capable of teaching arithmetic and reading." James moved to the window, his jaw tight with anger. "This is about more than the school. Brennan had his eye on the water rights to our south pasture for 2 years. He's looking for any excuse to undermine our standing in the community. Then perhaps we should reconsider the engagement," Eleanor said quietly. "If our arrangement is causing problems for the school, the children shouldn't suffer for it." Both men turned to stare at her. James's expression was unreadable, but Thomas looked genuinely surprised. "You'd give up the teaching position?" Thomas asked. "I'd prioritize the community's needs over my own preferences. Those children deserve an education, and if my presence prevents that from happening, no." James's voice carried absolute finality. "We don't make decisions based on Patrick Brennan's prejudices. But if the school board withdraws their offer, then we'll find another solution." James pulled on his coat and hat. "I'm riding to town. It's time Mr. Brennan and I had a conversation about appropriate behavior toward my future wife." The protective tone in his voice sent warmth through Eleanor's chest, but she couldn't let him fight her battles for her. She'd learned long ago that respect had to be earned, not defended by others. "I'm coming with you." "That's not necessary." "It's absolutely necessary." She stood, reaching for her own coat. "If I'm going to be part of this community, I need to face its challenges directly. Hiding behind your reputation won't serve anyone's long-term interests." The ride to town passed in tense silence, both of them lost in thought. Copper Creek buzzed with activity despite the early hour, women hanging laundry, men loading supplies, children playing in the street. But Eleanor noticed the subtle signs of division. Conversations that stopped when they passed, sideways glances, the way some people turned away rather than offer their usual greetings. The school committee meeting had been scheduled for 10 o'clock, in the back room of Morrison's General Store. By the time they arrived, a crowd had gathered outside, their voices raised in heated discussion. Patrick Brennan stood at the center, a stocky man with red hair and an aggressive manner that commanded attention through volume rather than logic. A woman who answers marriage advertisements has questionable morals, he was saying as they approached. Do we want someone like that influencing our children's character development? Patrick Brennan. James's voice cut through the argument like a blade. I believe you have something to say about my fiancée. The crowd fell silent, turning to watch the confrontation. Brennan's face flushed darker red, but he didn't back down. I have concerns about the moral example being set, he said, puffing out his chest. Living in sin, pretending to be engaged when everyone knows it's just convenient. Stop. Eleanor stepped forward before James could respond, her voice carrying the authority she'd developed managing difficult household staff. Mr. Brennan, you've made serious accusations about my character. I believe I deserve the opportunity to respond. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, measuring her worthiness to teach their children, to be part of their community, to matter in their small corner of the world. You're right that I answered a marriage advertisement, she began, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. I'm 53 years old, widowed for 24 years, and I came to Wyoming because James McKinnon offered me something no man in Boston ever had, a true partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. You question my morals because I'm not married yet, but James and I are building something more substantial than a rushed ceremony could provide. We're learning to trust each other, to work together, to become true partners in every sense. If that strikes you as immoral, perhaps you should examine what marriage means to you. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded approval, while others frowned at her directness. As for my qualifications to teach, Eleanor continued, I've managed complex households, balanced intricate budgets, and coordinated the education of dozens of children from wealthy Boston families. I've read more books than this town's library contains, and I understand the value of knowledge in ways that go beyond mere academic achievement. She gestured toward the children who had gathered at the edge of the crowd, their faces bright with curiosity. These children deserve better than the sporadic lessons they receive now. They deserve someone who will challenge them, who will show them that learning never stops, who will prepare them for a world larger than Copper Creek. Pretty words, Brennan sneered. But what happens when you get tired of playing teacher and run back to Boston? What happens to our children then? The question struck at Eleanor's deepest fear, that she would prove too old, too set in her ways, too unprepared for the harsh realities of frontier life. But as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, she realized something had changed in the weeks since her arrival. She no longer felt like a stranger here. I'm not playing at anything, Mr. Brennan. I came here to build a life, not to visit one. This is my community now. These are my neighbors, and these children will be as important to me as if they were my own. Sarah Johnson, a young mother with 3 school-age children, stepped forward from the crowd. Mrs. Whitman helped my Johnny with his arithmetic last week when she was visiting. In one afternoon, she taught him more about fractions than he'd learned in months of lessons with whoever was available. That's right, added Heinrich Kowalski, whose English still carried a heavy German accent. My Anna can barely read English. Mrs. Whitman, she makes special books with simple words, helps Anna practice every day. This is a teacher who cares about children. More voices joined in, parents sharing stories of Eleanor's informal help with their children's education, her patient explanations of difficult concepts, her genuine interest in each child's individual needs and abilities. Gradually, the mood of the crowd shifted from confrontation to consideration. Finally, Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife and unofficial leader of the school committee, stepped forward. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, whose approval carried significant weight in community decisions. "Mr. Brennan," she said crisply, "I've heard enough speculation about Mrs. Whitman's character. What I want to know is whether you have actual objections to her qualifications as an educator, or whether this is simply about your personal disapproval of her living arrangements." Brennan's face grew redder still. "I think a woman who would travel across the country to marry a stranger shows poor judgment. How can we trust her with our children's future the same way we trust anyone?" Mrs. Patterson replied, "by observing her actions rather than judging her circumstances." She turned to address the gathered crowd. "Mrs. Whitman has spent 3 weeks becoming acquainted with our children and our community. She's shown nothing but intelligence, patience, and genuine commitment to education. Unless someone has specific evidence of wrongdoing or incompetence, I see no reason to withdraw our offer." A vote was called, and the result was decisive. 12 families in favor of hiring Eleanor as the town's first official teacher, with only 3 opposed. Patrick Brennan stalked away, muttering about moral decay and poor judgment, but his influence had been broken by the community's direct experience with Eleanor's character. As the crowd dispersed, James touched Eleanor's elbow gently. "Well done," he said quietly. "You handled that better than I would have. I had to. This is my fight as much as yours." Mrs. Patterson approached them as they prepared to leave. "Mrs. Whitman, the school committee would like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss curriculum and schedules. We're hoping to begin regular classes by the 1st of November. I'll be there." Eleanor shook the older woman's hand gratefully. "Thank you for your support. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've survived your first winter teaching children who'd rather be hunting or helping with chores. Then we'll see if you still want to stay in Wyoming." The challenge in Mrs. Patterson's voice was good-natured, but Eleanor understood the deeper message. She'd won the right to try, but her ultimate success would depend on her ability to prove herself through actions rather than words. As they rode back to the ranch, James was unusually quiet. Finally, as they crested the hill that revealed the Circle M spread out below them, he spoke. "You could have let me handle Brennan. Most women would have expected their men to defend them. I'm not most women, and you're not just my man, you're my partner. Partners stand together, not behind each other." James rested on his horse and looked at her directly. "Is that what we are, partners?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. In the weeks since her arrival, they'd worked together, eaten together, shared evening conversations and morning plans. They'd built something that felt like partnership, but neither had defined it explicitly. "I hope so," Eleanor said honestly. "I hope we're building something that will last." "So do I." James urged his horse forward again. "So do I." That evening, as they reviewed the ranch books together by lamplight, Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She'd faced down community judgment and won the respect of her neighbors through her own efforts. She'd secured the teaching position that would give her purpose beyond the ranch. Most importantly, she'd proven to herself that she could adapt, could fight for what mattered, could build a new life on her own terms. Outside, the wind howled with the promise of winter's approach, but inside the solid stone house James had built, Eleanor felt warm and secure. She was exactly where she belonged. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that plummeted 30 degrees overnight and snow that fell in sheets across the landscape. Eleanor woke on the first Monday of the month to find the world transformed, fence posts capped with white, cattle huddled together for warmth, and the mountains barely visible through the swirling storm. From her bedroom window, she watched James and the crew moving through the blizzard like ghosts, checking water troughs and ensuring the cattle had access to hay. Even through the thick glass, she could see the strain on their faces as they battled the elements that would define their lives for the next 5 months. The schoolhouse in Copper Creek had been completed just in time, built from local timber, with a pot-bellied stove and windows facing south to capture every available ray of sunshine. It represented the community's investment in their children's future. Today would mark Eleanor's first official day as teacher, storm or no storm. Martha appeared in the doorway with steaming coffee and a worried expression. "You're not seriously thinking of riding to town in this weather? 14 children are expecting me." Eleanor pulled on her warmest wool dress and the heavy coat James had ordered from Denver. "Some of them will walk miles through this snow to get to school. James already left word that school should be cancelled today. No one expects you to. I expect me to." Eleanor braided her hair tightly and pinned it under a wool cap. "If I cancel on the first day because of weather, I'll spend the rest of winter proving I'm tough enough for this job." The ride to town tested every ounce of determination she possessed. The wind cut through her layers like knives, and snow stung her face despite the scarf wrapped across her nose and mouth. Her horse, a steady mare named Patience, picked her way carefully through drifts that reached nearly to her belly in places. When Eleanor finally reached the schoolhouse, she found 6 children already inside, their small forms clustered around the stove for warmth. They looked up with surprise and obvious relief when she entered, stamping snow from her boots and unwinding her frozen scarf. "Miss Whitman," 8-year-old Anna Kowalski jumped up from her seat. "Papa said you might not come because of the storm." "Your papa underestimated my stubbornness." Eleanor hung her coat on a peg and began lighting additional lamps to brighten the dim room. "Besides, 6 of my best students braved this weather to be here. I couldn't possibly disappoint you." The children who'd made it to school represented the full age range she'd be teaching, from 6-year-old Timothy Morrison to 15-year-old Rebecca Patterson. Some, like the Johnson boys, could read simple sentences but struggled with arithmetic. Others, like Rebecca, were academically advanced, but lacked exposure to literature and history beyond local events. "Today," Eleanor announced, pulling out the carefully planned lessons she'd prepared, "we're going to learn about weather patterns and how they affect agriculture. Since we're living through a perfect example, we might as well make it educational." She'd discovered that frontier children learned best when lessons connected directly to their daily experiences. Rather than starting with abstract concepts, she grounded everything in practical applications they could understand and use. "Timothy, can you tell me what happens to cattle when the temperature drops suddenly like it did last night?" The youngest boy stood proudly. "They huddle together and eat more hay to stay warm, just like we do around the stove." "Excellent. And Rebecca, why do you think ranchers move cattle to lower pastures before winter storms?" The teenager considered carefully. "Because wind is stronger at high elevation, and there's more shelter in the valleys." "Precisely. Now let's talk about how native peoples in this region prepared for winter storms and what we can learn from their methods." Eleanor had spent hours researching local indigenous practices, determined to give her students a complete understanding of their environment. The children listened with rapt attention as she described traditional weather prediction methods, seasonal migration patterns, and survival techniques that had sustained people in this harsh climate for centuries. By midday, 3 more children had arrived, their parents having decided the storm was manageable enough for the short journey to town. Eleanor adapted her lessons seamlessly, dividing the group by skill level while keeping everyone engaged in the same general topic. During the lunch break, she heated soup on the stove and distributed biscuits Martha had insisted she bring. The children ate gratefully, their cheeks red from cold, but their spirits high with the excitement of being at their new school despite the weather. "Miss Whitman," asked 12-year-old Johnny Johnson, "is it true you came here to marry Mr. McKinnon?" The direct question didn't surprise her. Children had no social filters, and she'd expected curiosity about her unusual situation. "Yes, we corresponded through letters for several months before I decided to come to Wyoming. Do you love him?" This from 10-year-old Sarah Rodriguez, her dark eyes serious. Eleanor considered how to answer honestly without providing inappropriate details. "Mr. McKinnon and I are building something special together. Respect, friendship, and partnership. Love can grow from those foundations, just like plants grow from good soil." "My mama says love comes first," Sarah persisted. "Your mama is wise. There are many different ways for people to find happiness together. Some start with love and build everything else from there. Others start with friendship and respect and find that love follows naturally." Rebecca Patterson, mature beyond her 15 years, nodded understanding. "Like business partners who become friends." "Exactly like that, except the business is building a life together." The afternoon brought lessons in arithmetic, using cattle counting and grain measuring as practical applications. Eleanor had learned that frontier children needed to see immediate relevance in their education. Abstract mathematics meant nothing to a 12-year-old boy who might leave school to work full-time on his family's ranch, but understanding how to calculate feed costs and breeding ratios could determine his future success. As the storm began to abate and parents arrived to collect their children, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction of a successful first day. The children had been engaged, curious, and eager to learn. More importantly, they'd seen her as a real teacher, not just the mail-order bride playing at education. Mrs. Patterson arrived with the last group of parents, her expression pleased, as she surveyed the organized classroom and listened to her daughter's enthusiastic account of the day's lessons. "Weather prediction and indigenous practices," she murmured approvingly. "Most teachers would have cancelled school or stuck to simple recitation. These children are too intelligent for simple recitation. They deserve an education that prepares them for the real challenges they'll face, including the challenge of winter in Wyoming territory, especially that." The ride back to the ranch passed more easily, with the wind dying down and the snow reduced to occasional flurries. Eleanor found herself looking forward to the warm house, the evening meal with James and the crew, and the chance to share her successful first day. She arrived to find unusual activity around the barn. Several horses she didn't recognize stood, tied to the hitching post, and voices carried across the yard despite the muffling effect of the snow. As she approached the house, James emerged from the barn with 3 men she'd never seen before. "Eleanor." James's voice carried tension she'd rarely heard. "Perfect timing. We have visitors." The 3 strangers wore badges that identified them as territorial marshals. Their leader, a tall man with graying hair and shrewd eyes, stepped forward with official courtesy. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm Marshal Davidson. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your time in Boston." The polite words carried an undertone that made Eleanor's stomach clench with sudden apprehension. "What kind of questions?" "Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside. It's rather cold for extended discussion." In the warmth of the main room, with James standing protectively beside her chair, Marshal Davidson pulled out a leather folder and extracted several documents. "Mrs. Whitman, are you acquainted with a man named Harrison Pemberton of Boston?" The name hit her like a physical blow. Harrison Pemberton, son of the family she'd served for 8 years, managing their household with meticulous care until his gambling debts and drinking had made her position untenable. I know him. I managed his family's household until last spring. And during that time, did you have access to the family's financial records and valuables? James moved closer to her chair, his presence offering silent support. What exactly are you suggesting, Marshal? I'm not suggesting anything yet, Mr. McKinnon. I'm gathering information about a theft that occurred in Boston this past August. Someone with intimate knowledge of the Pemberton household stole jewelry and cash worth approximately $15,000. Eleanor's hands trembled as the implications became clear. You think I stole from the Pembertons? Young Mr. Pemberton claims you had access to his mother's jewelry collection and knowledge of where the family kept cash reserves. He also points out that you left Boston rather suddenly after the theft was discovered. I left Boston because Harrison Pemberton was embezzling funds from his father's business to pay gambling debts. When I discovered the discrepancies in the household accounts, he threatened me. I feared for my safety. Marshal Davidson made notes in a small book. Did you report these threats to the authorities? Who would believe the word of a servant against the son of one of Boston's most prominent families? The old bitterness crept into Eleanor's voice. I had no proof of his embezzlement, only suspicious patterns in the accounts I managed. Convenient that you'd make counter-accusations now that you're facing charges. She's facing no charges until you have evidence, James interjected sharply. And I suggest you be very careful about making accusations against my fiancée based on the word of a man with obvious motives to shift blame. The second marshal, younger and less experienced, spoke up. There's also the matter of timing. The theft occurred within days of Mrs. Whitman's departure from Boston. The theft occurred within days of Harrison Pemberton discovering that I'd documented his embezzlement, Eleanor corrected. I kept detailed records of every discrepancy I found, including dates and amounts. Do you still have those records? Eleanor's heart sank. I brought very few papers with me. I never imagined I'd need evidence of someone else's crimes. Marshal. Davidson closed his notebook with obvious satisfaction. Mrs. Whitman, I'm placing you under arrest for grand theft. You'll need to return to Boston to face charges. No, James's voice carried absolute finality. You have no jurisdiction here to arrest anyone based on accusations from a known gambler and embezzler. Mr. McKinnon, interfering with a federal investigation. There's no federal crime here. This is a civil matter between private parties, and you have no warrant for Mrs. Whitman's arrest. The legal standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Thomas appeared in the doorway with news that changed everything. James, sorry to interrupt, but there's a telegram for Mrs. Whitman. Came through just before the lines went down in the storm. Eleanor accepted the yellow paper with trembling hands, afraid of what additional bad news it might contain. But as she read the message, hope flared in her chest. It's from Mrs. Pemberton, Harrison's mother. She looked up at the marshals with new confidence. She says Harrison confessed to the theft 3 days ago. He's been arrested and charged. She's sending a formal letter clearing me of all suspicion, along with an apology for her son's attempt to implicate me. Marshal Davidson's face darkened with embarrassment and anger. Let me see that. The telegram was brief but unambiguous. Harrison confessed theft, stop falsely accused you, stop formal exoneration, follows stop deepest apologies, stop Eleanor Pemberton, stop. Well, said the youngest marshal after a long silence, that appears to resolve the matter. It resolves nothing, Davidson snapped. We came all this way based on false information. You came all this way because you didn't bother to verify your source before making accusations, James replied coldly. I suggest you return to Boston and arrest the actual criminal instead of harassing innocent women based on the lies of gambling addicts. After the marshals left, muttering about wasted time and false reports, Eleanor sat in stunned silence. The accusation had lasted less than an hour, but it had felt like reliving every moment of powerlessness she'd experienced in Boston. "Are you all right?" James asked gently. "I'm fine, just shaken by how quickly everything could have changed." She looked at him directly. "Did you believe them, even for a moment?" "Not for a second. I know your character, Eleanor. I've watched your work, seen how you treat people, observed your integrity in every decision you make. No amount of accusations could make me doubt what I know to be true." The simple faith in his words meant more than any declaration of love could have. This was partnership in its truest form, standing together against external threats, trusting in each other's character despite evidence to the contrary. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For believing in me, for defending me, for being exactly the partner I hoped you'd be." That evening, as they worked together on the ranch books, Eleanor reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 months. She'd survived community judgment, proven herself as a teacher, faced false accusations with dignity, and found in James McKinnon a man who valued her for exactly who she was. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in pristine snow. Inside, warmed by firelight and companionship, Eleanor had never felt more at home. December brought the kind of cold that seemed to leach life from everything it touched. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero, and the wind carried ice crystals that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. For 3 weeks, the world beyond the ranch buildings disappeared into a white void that made travel impossible and survival a daily challenge. Eleanor had never experienced such isolation. In Boston, even the worst blizzards lasted only days, before the city resumed its relentless pace. Here, the storm stretched endlessly, broken only by brief periods of calm that revealed a landscape so transformed it seemed alien. Fence lines vanished under snowdrifts 8 feet deep. The barn required constant attention to prevent the roof from collapsing under the weight of accumulating ice. Inside the ranch house, the crew had gathered for what James called winter quarters, a period when outdoor work became impossible and survival depended on careful preparation and shared resources. The bunkhouse, designed for warmer weather, couldn't be adequately heated during extreme cold, so the men moved into the main house, sleeping in the parlor and extra bedrooms, sharing meals and chores in the enforced intimacy of people dependent on each other for survival. "It's like being aboard ship in a storm," Charlie Moss explained as he helped Eleanor prepare breakfast for 12 people. Nothing to do but wait it out and keep everyone fed and warm. The cooking arrangements required constant coordination. Martha directed operations from the kitchen, while Eleanor managed supplies and meal planning. They prepared enormous quantities of food 3 times daily: pancakes and bacon for breakfast, stew and bread for lunch, roasted meat and vegetables for dinner. The work was exhausting but necessary. Men who spent their days maintaining the animals and buildings in sub-zero temperatures needed substantial fuel to keep their bodies functioning. "We're going through supplies faster than I calculated," Eleanor told James as they reviewed inventory lists by lamplight. "At this rate, we'll run short of flour and coffee before February." James studied her careful tallies, his expression grave. The supply run to Cheyenne was supposed to happen in November, but the weather moved in too early. Nothing's getting through now until spring. What do other ranches do in situations like this? Some don't make it. That's why so many operations fail in their first few years. They don't understand how to prepare for the worst possibilities. The reality of their isolation struck Eleanor with new force. If they ran out of essential supplies, there would be no emergency deliveries, no alternative sources. They would have to survive on what they had stored, supplemented by whatever they could hunt or forage. "We need to implement rationing immediately," she said, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. "If we reduce coffee consumption by half and stretch the flour with cornmeal, we can extend our supplies by 6 weeks. The men won't like reduced coffee rations. They'll like starving even less. Over the following days, Eleanor discovered talents she'd never known she possessed. She learned to make soap from rendered fat and lye, to preserve meat by smoking and salt curing, to stretch limited ingredients into filling meals that maintained morale despite harsh conditions. When young Pete Sullivan developed a fever that turned into pneumonia, she nursed him through the crisis with remedies learned from medical books and practical experience caring for her late husband. "You're a natural frontier woman," Martha observed, as they worked together to prepare Christmas dinner, despite severely limited supplies. "I had my doubts when you first arrived, but you've adapted faster than most people born to this life." The compliment meant more to Eleanor than any praise she'd received for managing elaborate Boston dinner parties. Here, competence measured itself in survival and respect was earned through contribution to the group's welfare. Christmas morning dawned clear and brutally cold, with sunshine that created diamond sparkles on the snow but provided no warmth. The men had fashioned simple gifts from available materials: whittled wooden toys, braided horsehair belts, carved bone buttons. Eleanor had used scraps of fabric to make warm mittens for everyone, working by lamplight after the others slept. "It's not much compared to Boston Christmases," James said, as they shared a quiet moment on the enclosed porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold. "It's better," Eleanor replied honestly. "In Boston, Christmas was about displaying wealth and maintaining social obligations. This feels real, people who care about each other sharing what they have. Do you miss it? The elaborate celebrations, the fancy food, the social whirl?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. Did she miss the silk gowns and crystal chandeliers, the orchestra music and 7-course dinners? The woman she'd been 6 months ago would have said yes immediately, but that woman had been lonely despite constant company, purposeless despite endless activity. "I miss some things," she said finally. "Good books, theatre performances, conversations about art and literature. But I don't miss feeling invisible in a crowd of people who knew my name but knew nothing about who I really was. And who are." "You really?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. In Boston, she'd been defined by her role: the competent widow, the reliable household manager, the woman who solved other people's problems while having no life of her own. Here, she'd discovered aspects of herself that had been dormant for decades. "I'm someone who can learn new things, who can adapt to challenges, who can be essential rather than just useful." She paused, watching a hawk circle against the brilliant blue sky. "I'm someone who can build something meaningful with the right partner." James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I'm glad you came here, Eleanor, not just because you've made the ranch more profitable or because you've brought order to chaos. I'm glad because you've made this place feel like a home again." The conversation was interrupted by urgent shouts from the barn. Through the crystal-clear air, they could see Ben Rodriguez running toward the house, his movements expressing panic. Despite the distance, "Cattle!" he shouted as he approached. "The fence in Section 4 collapsed under the snow. Half the herd is scattered across the valley." James was moving before Ben finished speaking, pulling on his heaviest coat and boots. How many head? Maybe 200. They're spread out over miles, and more are wandering off every minute." The situation was catastrophic. Cattle scattered in a blizzard could freeze to death within hours, and recovering them in deep snow would be nearly impossible. The financial loss would be devastating, but the immediate concern was saving as many animals as possible. "I'm coming with you," Eleanor said, reaching for her own winter gear. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. You need every able body, and I can ride as well as any of your men." James started to protest, but Charlie Moss interrupted. "She's right, boss. We need all hands, and Mrs. Whitman's proven she can handle herself." Within minutes, the entire crew was mounted and heading towards Section 4, following Ben's tracks through snow that reached their horses' bellies. The going was treacherous. Hidden rocks and fallen branches created constant hazards, and the cold was so intense that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Eleanor had never attempted anything so physically demanding. Her horse struggled through the drifts, breath streaming in clouds that instantly froze into ice crystals. Her feet went numb despite thick wool socks and waterproof boots, and her face ached where the scarf didn't provide complete protection. The scattered cattle were visible long before they reached them, dark shapes against the white landscape, some standing in confused groups, others wandering aimlessly in search of shelter. Many had already succumbed to the cold, their frozen forms marking the urgency of their rescue mission. "Spread out!" James shouted over the wind. "Work in pairs. Drive them toward the south pasture. There's better shelter there." The next 4 hours tested every ounce of strength and determination Eleanor possessed. She worked alongside Thomas, using her horse to guide confused cattle towards safety while battling wind that threatened to knock her from the saddle. The animals, disoriented by the storm and deep snow, resisted direction and often broke away from the group just as progress seemed possible. "Stay close," Thomas warned during a brief rest to let their horses recover. "Visibility can drop to nothing in minutes out here. If you get separated from the group, find shelter and wait for help, rather than trying to navigate alone." They lost 6 cattle to the cold, but managed to drive nearly 180 to the relative safety of the south pasture, where windbreaks and accessible hay would help them survive until the weather improved. By the time they returned to the ranch house, Eleanor could barely feel her hands despite thick gloves, and her legs shook with exhaustion. "Hot baths and whiskey for everyone," Martha announced as they stumbled through the door. "And no arguments about it." As Eleanor, soaked in a tub of water heated on the kitchen stove, she reflected on the day's work. She'd proven herself capable of the hardest physical labor the ranch could demand, had contributed meaningfully to saving their livelihood, and had earned the crew's respect through shared hardship rather than social position. That evening, as they gathered around the fire to share the day's experiences, James stood and raised his glass of whiskey. "To partnership," he said, his eyes meeting Eleanor's across the room. "To people who stand together when everything depends on it." "To partnership," the crew echoed, and Eleanor felt the words settle into her heart like a promise finally fulfilled. Later, as she and James worked together to update the ranch records with the day's losses and recoveries, he broached a subject that had been developing between them for weeks. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about our arrangement." She looked up from her calculations, suddenly nervous. Had the day's events revealed something about her that changed his mind about their partnership? What about it? "We've been engaged for 3 months, and we've built something solid together, but we've never talked about making it official. Actually, getting married rather than just planning to eventually." The suggestion hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that went beyond legal formalities. They'd been living as partners in everything but name, sharing responsibilities and decisions, building a life together based on mutual respect and growing affection. "What are you proposing?" she asked carefully. "I'm proposing that we stop calling this an engagement and start calling it a marriage, not because we have to, but because we want to, because what we've built together deserves recognition and commitment." Eleanor set down her pen and studied his face in the lamplight. She could see sincerity there, and something deeper, not the passionate love of youth, but the steady affection of 2 people who'd chosen each other deliberately and discovered compatibility that ran deeper than initial attraction. "Are you asking me to marry you, James McKinnon?" "I'm asking if you'll be my wife, Eleanor Whitman, in name as well as partnership, for better and worse, through cattle drives and blizzards and whatever else this country throws at us." She thought about the woman who'd stepped off the train in Copper Creek 4 months ago, uncertain, defensive, afraid of being judged too old and too set in her ways. That woman had been looking for security and purpose. The woman she'd become wanted something more, a true partnership with a man who valued her mind as much as her competence, who stood beside her rather than in front of her, who offered her a future built on shared dreams rather than social expectations. "Yes," she said simply, "I'll marry you." They sealed the agreement with a handshake, as they had their business partnership months earlier. But this time, James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture that spoke of affection earned rather than assumed. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the ranch buildings, but inside the solid stone house, two people who'd found each other across impossible distances planned a future that would be built on wisdom rather than passion, partnership rather than romance, and love that had grown slowly from respect into something unshakable. The worst of winter was yet to come, but they would face it together. January brought unexpected challenges that tested every skill Eleanor had developed since arriving at the Circle M. The wedding had been planned for the first Saturday of the month, with Reverend Morrison traveling from Cheyenne to perform the ceremony. But 3 days before the scheduled date, a messenger arrived with devastating news. The Reverend had broken his leg in a fall and couldn't travel for at least 6 weeks. "We could postpone until spring," James suggested as they sat in his office, reviewing their options. Wait for better weather and a proper minister. Eleanor looked up from the letter she'd been writing to her former employer in Boston, informing him of her marriage. "Or we could find another solution. I've been corresponding with Judge Harrison in Laramie. He's authorized to perform civil ceremonies, and he's traveling through Copper Creek next week on territorial business. A civil ceremony isn't the same as a church wedding. No, it's not. But it's legal, it's practical, and it would make our partnership official before the spring cattle drive begins." She set down her pen and faced him directly. "James, I'm 53 years old. I've waited long enough for my real life to begin." The simple statement carried weight that surprised them both. In the months since her arrival, Eleanor had transformed. From a woman seeking security into someone eager to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. The change was evident in everything: her posture, her voice, her willingness to take risks that would have terrified her in Boston. "Then we'll have Judge Harrison marry us," James decided. "Martha can handle the arrangements, and we'll celebrate properly when Reverend Morrison can give us a church blessing in the spring." News of their decision spread quickly through the small community. Mrs. Patterson arrived the next day with an offer to host the wedding reception at her house, while the Kowalski family volunteered to provide music for dancing. Even Patrick Brennan, whose opposition to Eleanor's teaching position had been decisively defeated, grudgingly offered congratulations and a promise to attend the ceremony. "The whole town wants to celebrate with you," Martha observed as she planned the menu for the reception. "You've become part of the community faster than most people manage in years." The observation touched something deep in Eleanor's heart. In Boston, she'd lived for 24 years without feeling truly connected to anyone or anything. Here, in less than 6 months, she'd found not just a husband, but a home in the fullest sense of the word. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with temperatures hovering near zero, but brilliant sunshine that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like diamonds. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best blue wool dress, the same one she'd worn for their first dinner together, with the addition of a lace collar she'd sewn during the long winter evenings. Judge Harrison proved to be a jovial man in his 60s, whose circuit through the territory had given him extensive experience with frontier weddings. He arrived at the courthouse in Copper Creek precisely at noon, carrying the legal documents that would transform their partnership into marriage. Unusual circumstances. he commented as he reviewed their situation. Most couples I marry are young and eager to start families. You two seem more interested in formalizing a business arrangement. With respect, Your Honor, Eleanor replied, we're interested in formalizing a life partnership that encompasses business, friendship, and mutual support. Age has given us perspective about what truly matters in marriage. Well said. And Mr. McKinnon, are you prepared to take Mrs. Whitman as your wife, understanding that you're gaining not just a spouse, but a full partner in all your endeavors? I am, Your Honor. I can't imagine facing the challenges ahead without her. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They exchanged simple gold bands that James had ordered from Denver, spoke vows they'd written themselves, emphasizing partnership and mutual respect, and sealed their union with a kiss that felt like a promise of shared adventures to come. The reception at the Patterson house overflowed with well-wishers from throughout the territory. Ranchers and their families had traveled for hours through difficult conditions to celebrate with them, bringing gifts of practical items needed for frontier life. Hand-forged tools, preserving jars, quilts sewn by the local women's circle. You've made quite an impression, observed Dr. William Fletcher, who'd ridden from Laramie specifically for the wedding. People are talking about the schoolteacher who helped save cattle in a blizzard and the mail-order bride who proved too valuable to lose. Eleanor danced with James to music provided by Heinrich Kowalski's fiddle and his son's accordion, their movements careful and dignified rather than passionate, but filled with the warmth of genuine affection. She also danced with each of the ranch hands, with Judge Harrison, and with several of her students who attended with their families. As the evening wound down and guests began the journey home, Mrs. Patterson pulled Eleanor aside for a private conversation. I want to apologize, the older woman said directly. When James first announced his engagement to a mail-order bride, I thought he was making a terrible mistake. I expected someone desperate and unsuitable, someone who would take advantage of his loneliness. Instead, you got a middle-aged widow with strong opinions and stubborn tendencies. I got a woman who understands her own worth and isn't afraid to prove it. Mrs. Patterson's smile was warm and genuine. You've exceeded every expectation, my dear. This community is fortunate to have you. The return journey to the ranch passed. In comfortable silence, both James and Eleanor wrapped in their own thoughts about the day and its significance. They were married now, legally and officially partners in every sense that mattered. That night, they established sleeping arrangements that reflected their practical approach to marriage. James moved his belongings to the large bedroom that had been Mary Catherine's, while Eleanor kept the guest room that had become truly hers. The arrangement allowed for privacy and gradual intimacy as their relationship continued developing naturally. No pressure, no expectations, James said, as they stood in the hallway between their rooms. We have the rest of our lives to figure out how we want to live them. February brought the kind of crisis that tested marriages and partnerships alike. A telegram arrived from Denver with news that would reshape their future. Cattle prices had collapsed due to overproduction and a financial panic in the East. The premium prices Eleanor had negotiated for spring delivery had been cancelled, and buyers were offering 30% less than the previous year's rates. We're looking at a loss of nearly $8,000, James said, as they reviewed the financial implications. That's the difference between a profitable year and potential bankruptcy. Eleanor studied the figures, her mind racing through alternatives and possibilities. The ranch was well managed and efficiently run, but it wasn't prepared for such a dramatic market shift. What are our options? Sell at a loss and hope to recover next year, or hold the cattle and gamble that prices will improve by fall? What about alternative markets? You've been focused on beef sales, but what about breeding stock? James looked up from the ledgers with interest. What do you mean, you? These market reports show that while beef prices have collapsed, breeding stock prices remain stable. Ranchers who can't afford to buy beef cattle for restocking are still willing to pay premium prices for proven bloodlines. She pulled out the breeding charts they'd been maintaining throughout the winter. We have some of the finest Hereford genetics in the territory. Instead of selling our cattle for beef, what if we marketed the best animals as breeding stock and kept the others? For our own expansion, the idea was radical. Switching from beef production to breeding livestock required different expertise, different marketing approaches, and a much longer timeline for profit realization. But it also offered the possibility of higher profits and greater market stability. It would mean completely restructuring our operation, James said slowly. Different feeding programs, different facilities, different relationships with buyers. It would also mean building something unique in this territory. Most ranchers are trying to produce the most cattle at the lowest cost. We could focus on producing the best cattle at premium prices. They spent the next week researching the breeding market, corresponding with buyers in California and Texas, and calculating the costs of conversion. The financial projections were encouraging. Breeding stock could command prices 3 to 4 times higher than beef cattle, and the market was less volatile because buyers invested in long-term herd improvement rather than immediate consumption. There's risk involved, Eleanor admitted as they finalized their analysis. We'd be pioneering a new approach in this region, and it could take years to establish our reputation. But the potential rewards justify the risk? I believe they do. More importantly, this would give us control over our destiny rather than leaving us vulnerable to market fluctuations we can't predict or influence. James made the decision with characteristic directness. We'll do it. Convert to breeding stock production, starting with this year's calf crop. The announcement of their new business model created considerable interest among neighboring ranchers. Some were skeptical of the untested approach, while others showed immediate interest in purchasing breeding animals for their own operations. "You're either visionaries or fools," commented Jeremiah Walsh, whose ranch bordered theirs to the east. "Time will tell which." "Time usually does," Eleanor replied diplomatically. The spring calving season provided the first test of their new approach. Instead of viewing calves simply as future beef cattle, they evaluated each animal for breeding potential. Genetic characteristics, growth rates, temperament, and conformation to breed standards. The process required more detailed record-keeping and individual attention, but it also revealed the exceptional quality of their livestock. 23 calves show breeding potential, Eleanor announced after completing her evaluations. If we can market them successfully, they should command prices that exceed our entire previous year's profit. The validation of their strategy came sooner than expected. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, no relation to the Boston family, arrived from California in late March, seeking breeding stock for a new ranch venture near Sacramento. He examined their animals with the expertise of someone who understood superior genetics and was willing to pay accordingly. "Exceptional bloodlines," he confirmed after a thorough inspection. "I'll take 6 bulls and 20 heifers at your asking prices, with an option to purchase additional animals next year if they perform as expected." The sale generated more revenue than the ranch had earned in any previous quarter, validating their decision to focus on quality over quantity. More importantly, it established their reputation as breeders of superior livestock, attracting attention from buyers throughout the West. "We did it," James said that evening as they updated their financial records. "We took a crisis and turned it into an opportunity. We did it together," Eleanor corrected. "Neither of us could have managed this transformation alone." As spring progressed into early summer, their marriage settled into patterns that reflected their shared values and complementary strengths. James handled the physical aspects of ranch management, working with animals, supervising the crew, maintaining facilities. Eleanor managed the business side, financial planning, marketing, correspondence with buyers, and the detailed record-keeping their breeding operation required. But their partnership extended beyond simple division of labor. They made decisions, together supported each other through challenges, and discovered that their different backgrounds and experiences created a synergy that made them more effective together than either had been alone. "You know what surprises me most about marriage?" Eleanor asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "What's that?" "How natural it feels. I expected adjustment and compromise, but instead it feels like we were always meant to be partners." James reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of couples who'd weathered storms together. "Maybe we were. Maybe it just took us 50-odd years and a mail-order bride advertisement to find each other." The school year had ended successfully, with all 14 students advancing to appropriate levels, and several families requesting that Eleanor continue teaching through the summer months. Her reputation as an educator had spread throughout the territory, attracting students from ranches as far as 50 miles away. "I'm thinking about expanding the curriculum," she told James as they planned for the following year, "adding advanced mathematics, literature, and even basic business principles. These children deserve preparation for a changing world. Whatever you think best. You've proven yourself as a teacher just as thoroughly as you have as a rancher." The Yehudi compliment meant everything to Eleanor. At 53, she'd discovered talents and capabilities she'd never known she possessed. More importantly, she'd found a place where those abilities were valued and utilized to their fullest potential. As they prepared for bed that night, still in separate rooms but with doors left open for easy conversation, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a cramped Boston brownstone to a thriving Wyoming ranch. She'd come west seeking security and found adventure. She'd answered an advertisement for companionship and discovered true partnership. Most surprisingly, she'd learned that wisdom and experience were more valuable than youth and beauty in building a life that mattered. At an age when society considered her past her prime, she'd found her true calling and the partner who valued everything she had to offer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, summer storms, market fluctuations, the endless demands of running a successful ranch. But tonight, Mrs. Eleanor McKinnon fell asleep knowing she was exactly where she belonged, with a man who saw her worth and a future limited only by their shared vision and determination. 2 years after her arrival in Wyoming Territory, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the expanded schoolhouse, watching her 26 students work through their morning lessons. The original building had proven too small for the growing enrollment, prompting the town council to fund an addition that doubled the classroom space and included a small library stocked with books she'd ordered from publishers in New York and Chicago. The success of her educational program had attracted families from across the territory. Some parents moved to Copper Creek specifically to ensure their children could attend her school, while others sent their youngsters to board with local families during the academic year. The school had become a source of regional pride and a catalyst for the town's growth. Miss McKinnon called out 15-year-old Samuel Patterson, using the name the students had adopted despite her marriage. "I've finished the algebra problems you assigned. Should I move on to the geometry section?" "Please do, Samuel, and remember to show your work clearly. Mathematical reasoning is as important as finding the correct answer." Her teaching methods had evolved considerably since that first day during the blizzard. She developed individualized curricula for different skill levels, established correspondence relationships with educators in established cities, and even begun preparing advanced students for university entrance examinations. 3 of her former pupils had already departed for colleges in Denver and San Francisco, carrying letters of recommendation that opened doors previously closed to frontier children. The morning routine was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure, Dr. Catherine Hayes, the Territorial Education Supervisor who conducted annual evaluations of schools throughout Wyoming. Dr. Hayes was a formidable woman in her 40s who'd gained her position through exceptional qualifications and unwavering determination to improve frontier education standards. "Mrs. McKinnon," Dr. Hayes said formally, "I hope you don't mind an unscheduled visit. I was in the area and wanted to observe your innovative teaching methods firsthand." Eleanor welcomed the inspection. Her school's reputation had spread throughout the territory, attracting both praise and skepticism from educational authorities who questioned whether a former household manager could truly provide quality instruction. "Please observe anything you'd like, Dr. Hayes. We're covering agricultural science this morning, studying soil composition and crop rotation patterns." For the next 2 hours, Dr. Hayes moved quietly through the classroom, taking notes as Eleanor guided students through complex lessons that integrated mathematics, science, history, and practical applications. The older students were calculating acreage yields, while the younger ones learned basic botany through examining plant specimens collected on weekend nature walks. During the lunch break, while students ate their meals outside in the warm September sunshine, Dr. Hayes requested a private conference. "Mrs. McKinnon, I must confess I came here with considerable skepticism. Reports of your methods seem too good to be true, particularly given your unconventional background." Eleanor waited, accustomed to such preliminary statements from visiting officials. "However," Dr. Hayes continued, "what I've observed this morning represents the finest primary education I've encountered anywhere in the territory. Your students demonstrate genuine understanding rather than mere memorization, and your integration of practical applications with academic theory is exemplary." The praise meant more than any compliment Eleanor had received. Official recognition of her teaching abilities validated the career she'd built from nothing more than determination and natural aptitude. "There's another matter I want to discuss," Dr. Hayes added. "The territorial government is establishing a teacher training college in Laramie. We need someone to develop the curriculum and serve as the founding director. The position would require relocating, but it offers the opportunity to influence education throughout the entire territory." The offer caught Eleanor completely off guard. A year earlier, such recognition would have seemed impossible. Now, it represented validation of everything she'd worked to achieve, but it also meant leaving the life she'd built at the Circle M, abandoning the partnership that had become the foundation of her identity. "It's a generous offer, Dr. Hayes, but I'll need time to consider it carefully. My responsibilities here extend beyond teaching." Of course, the position wouldn't begin until next summer, so you have months to decide, but I hope you'll give it serious consideration. You have the potential to shape frontier education for generations. That evening, Eleanor shared the offer with James as they reviewed the ranch's quarterly financial reports. Their breeding operation had exceeded every projection, with buyers traveling from as far as Texas and Oregon to purchase their livestock. The Circle M had become synonymous with superior genetics and innovative breeding practices. "It's an incredible opportunity," James said after she'd explained the details. "The kind of recognition most teachers never receive. But it would mean leaving Wyoming, leaving the ranch, leaving—" She gestured around the office, where they'd spent so many evenings planning their shared future. "Leaving me." The simple statement hung between them, weighted with implications neither wanted to explore fully. Their marriage had evolved into something deeper than either had expected. Not the passionate romance of youth, but the profound connection of two people who'd chosen each other deliberately and discovered compatibility that strengthened with time. "I don't want to leave," Eleanor said finally, "but I also don't want to reject an opportunity that could help countless children throughout the territory." James stood and moved to the window, looking out at the ranch buildings silhouetted against the starlit sky. What if there was a way to do both? What do you mean? What if we could bring the teacher training program here? Establish a regional education center that serves Wyoming and the surrounding territories. The idea was audacious, creating an educational institution from nothing in a location far from established centers of learning. But as they discussed the possibilities, the concept began to seem not just feasible, but logical. We have the land, the facilities that could be expanded, and a proven educational model, Eleanor mused. The railroad connection makes travel accessible, and the cost of living here is much lower than in Laramie. More importantly, we have a partnership that's proven capable of turning unconventional ideas into successful realities. They spent the following weeks developing a comprehensive proposal for the Territorial Education Department. The plan called for establishing the Wyoming Frontier Education Institute at Copper Creek, with programs for teacher training, advanced secondary education, and agricultural sciences. The location offered practical advantages: lower costs, easier access for rural students, and the opportunity to integrate academic learning with frontier skills. The proposal required significant investment, both financial and personal. They would need to construct additional buildings, recruit qualified instructors, and establish relationships with educational institutions in established cities. Most challenging, they would be pioneering an entirely new model of frontier education. "Are we crazy to attempt this?" Eleanor asked as they finalized their presentation for the territorial board. "Probably, but we've been crazy before, and it's worked out well for us." The board meeting in Cheyenne brought together territorial officials, education experts, and community leaders to evaluate competing proposals for the teacher training college. Eleanor and James presented their vision with careful preparation and passionate conviction, emphasizing the advantages of their integrated approach to frontier education. The traditional model assumes that quality education requires urban settings and established institutions, Eleanor argued. But frontier communities need teachers who understand rural challenges, who can adapt academic principles to practical applications, who can inspire students to pursue learning despite isolation and limited resources. The questions were challenging and sometimes skeptical. Board members questioned whether a remote location could attract qualified faculty, whether frontier students could meet academic standards, whether the integrated model would provide sufficient depth in individual subjects. James fielded the practical concerns with the same systematic approach he applied to ranch management. "We're not proposing to replicate Eastern educational models in a Western setting. We're proposing to create something uniquely suited to frontier needs while maintaining rigorous academic standards." The decision came 3 weeks later in a telegram that changed their lives. Proposal approved, stop funding, authorized, stop congratulations, stop begin planning, immediately stop. The news spread quickly through Copper Creek, generating excitement and apprehension in equal measure. Some residents welcomed the prospect of their small town becoming an educational center, while others worried about the changes that growth would bring. "It'll mean more people, more activity, more complications," warned Charlie Moss as the ranch crew discussed the implications over dinner. "It'll also mean more opportunities for our children, more economic development, more recognition." "For our community," Martha countered. "Sometimes growth is worth the complications it creates." The construction phase tested every organizational skill Eleanor had developed. She coordinated with architects, supervised contractors, managed budgets, and recruited faculty while maintaining her teaching responsibilities and ranch duties. The integrated approach they'd developed served them well, treating the Education Institute as another ranch operation that required careful planning, efficient execution, and constant attention to practical details. By the following spring, The Wyoming Frontier Education Institute consisted of 6 buildings arranged around a central quadrangle, with dormitories for residential students, classrooms equipped with the latest teaching materials, and laboratories for agricultural and scientific instruction. The faculty included educators recruited from established colleges, practical experts from various industries, and local specialists who understood frontier conditions. The first class of teacher trainees arrived in June, 24 men and women from across the territory who would spend intensive summer sessions learning both academic subjects and practical teaching methods. The diversity of the group reflected the frontier's democratic character. Former ranch hands seeking new careers, educated women from eastern cities, immigrant farmers' sons and daughters seeking advancement through education. "You've created something remarkable here," observed Professor David Montgomery, whom they'd recruited from the University of Colorado to teach mathematics and sciences. This integration of theoretical knowledge with practical application represents a new model for American education. The opening ceremonies drew visitors from throughout the territory and beyond. Territorial Governor John Campbell delivered the keynote address, praising the Institute as an example of frontier innovation and determination. Dr. Hayes, whose original job offer had sparked the entire enterprise, spoke about the importance of adapting education to local needs while maintaining universal standards. But the moment that meant most to Eleanor came during the student presentations, when her former pupils demonstrated the knowledge and skills they'd acquired through her innovative methods. These young people, ranch children and town dwellers alike, spoke confidently about complex subjects, solved challenging problems, and articulated dreams that extended far beyond their humble origins. "You gave us permission to think beyond our circumstances," said Rebecca Patterson, now 18 and preparing to attend college in California. "You showed us that learning never stops, that education is about becoming the best version of ourselves." That evening, as the last visitors departed and the Institute settled into a quiet routine, Eleanor and James walked through the campus they'd created together. The buildings stood solid and purposeful in the gathering twilight, representing not just an educational institution, but a testament to what partnership could accomplish. "Do you ever regret answering that advertisement?" James asked, as they paused beside the fountain that marked the center of the quadrangle. Eleanor considered the question seriously, as she always did his thoughtful inquiries. She thought about the woman who'd stepped off the train in Copper Creek 3 years earlier, uncertain, defensive, afraid of being judged inadequate. That woman had been seeking security and finding instead adventure, purpose, and love that had grown from respect into something unshakable. "Never," she said finally. "I came here thinking I was too old to start over, too set in my ways to adapt, too ordinary to matter. Instead, I discovered that wisdom and experience have their own value, that partnerships built on mutual respect can accomplish extraordinary things, that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." "And who were you meant to be?" Eleanor smiled, thinking of her students, her school, the institute that would train teachers for generations of frontier children. "Someone who helps others discover their own potential. Someone who proves that age brings opportunity rather than limitation. Someone who shows that the best partnerships aren't based on passion alone, but on shared vision and mutual commitment to building something lasting." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the vast Wyoming sky. Around them, the institute buzzed with quiet activity. Students studying in their dormitories, faculty preparing lessons, maintenance crews ensuring everything functioned smoothly. It was their creation, born from the unlikely partnership between a widowed rancher who'd sought companionship and a displaced household manager who'd sought purpose. The story that had begun with a simple advertisement had become something neither could have imagined. A love story disguised as a business arrangement, a partnership that had transformed not just their own lives, but the educational opportunities available to an entire territory. They'd proved that wisdom mattered more than youth, that character counted more than beauty, that the best relationships were built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than fleeting passion. At 56, Eleanor McKinnon had found her calling, her home and her heart's partner. She'd discovered that sometimes the best things in life came to those who were brave enough to take chances, wise enough to recognize opportunity, and stubborn enough to prove that society's limitations were merely suggestions rather than absolute truths. The mail-order bride who'd been considered too old had become the educator who shaped the future, the partner who'd helped build an empire, the woman who'd proved that life's greatest adventures often began when conventional wisdom suggested they should be ending. And as she walked back to the stone house that had become her true home, hand in hand with the man who'd seen her worth when others saw only wrinkles, Eleanor McKinnon knew with absolute certainty that every risk had been worth taking, every challenge worth facing, every mile worth traveling to reach this moment of perfect contentment with a life well lived and a future bright with possibility. 5 years had passed since the Wyoming Frontier Education Institute opened its doors, and the transformation of Copper Creek from a dusty frontier town into a thriving educational center had exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. What had begun as Eleanor's small schoolhouse now encompassed a campus of 12 buildings, serving over 300 students from across the Western Territories and employing 42 faculty members who'd been recruited from universities throughout America and Europe. On this crisp October morning in 1889, Eleanor stood before the territorial legislature in Cheyenne, preparing to deliver testimony that would determine the future of frontier education. At 58, she commanded the room, with an authority that had been earned through years of proving skeptics wrong and transforming ambitious visions into concrete achievements. "Honorable legislators," she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd faced down blizzards, false accusations, and social prejudice. "I stand before you not as the mail-order bride who arrived in Wyoming 6 years ago, but as the director of an institution that has trained over 400 teachers who now serve communities from Montana to New Mexico." The packed gallery included reporters from Eastern newspapers who'd traveled west to document what the New York Times had called the most innovative educational experiment in American frontier history. Among them sat representatives from Harvard, Yale, and Columbia, all seeking to understand how a remote Wyoming institution had achieved national recognition for academic excellence. "The question before you today," Eleanor continued, "is whether to grant the Institute full collegiate status, allowing us to award bachelor's degrees in education and agricultural sciences. This decision will determine whether frontier education remains forever secondary to Eastern institutions, or whether we establish our own standards of excellence suited to Western needs." The debate that followed revealed the tensions that had shaped her entire journey west. Conservative legislators questioned whether frontier communities needed college-educated teachers, whether agricultural science warranted degree-level study, whether a woman with no formal pedagogical training could truly direct a collegiate institution. Senator Franklin Morrison, Patrick Brennan's political ally and longtime skeptic of the Institute, rose to voice the opposition's primary concerns. "Mrs. McKinnon has certainly achieved remarkable things," he acknowledged grudgingly, "but granting collegiate status to an institution founded by someone who learned teaching through trial and error sets a dangerous precedent. What message does this send about the value of proper credentials and established educational traditions?" Eleanor had anticipated this line of attack. "Senator Morrison, with respect, you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether I have traditional credentials, it's whether our graduates can compete with those from any institution in America. And the evidence speaks for itself. She gestured toward Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the Institute's first graduates who'd recently been accepted to the medical college at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Hartwell scored higher on her entrance examinations than any applicant from Harvard or Yale that year. She credits her success to an education that taught her to think critically, solve problems creatively, and apply theoretical knowledge to practical challenges. The testimony continued for 3 hours, with Eleanor fielding questions about curriculum standards, faculty qualifications, financial sustainability, and long-term educational goals. Each query revealed the depth of preparation she'd invested. In this moment, the comprehensive understanding she'd developed of educational theory and practice through years of autodidactic study and practical application. Professor William Hayes from Columbia University, Dr. Catherine Hayes's brother and one of the most respected educational theorists in America, provided the most crucial support for their application. I have visited the Wyoming Frontier Education Institute twice in the past year, he testified. What I observed there represents the future of American education, integrated curricula that prepare students for real-world challenges, individualized instruction that recognizes diverse learning styles, and faculty who combine academic expertise with practical experience. Mrs. McKinnon has created something that established institutions are now trying to emulate. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than Eleanor had hoped, but decisive enough to matter. 18 in favor, 12 opposed. The Wyoming Frontier Education Institute would become the first institution west of the Mississippi to receive collegiate status based primarily on demonstrated results rather than traditional credentials. The celebration that evening at the Cheyenne Grand Hotel brought together supporters from across the territory. Territorial Governor Francis Warren delivered a toast that captured the significance of the achievement. Tonight we celebrate more than institutional recognition, he declared. We celebrate the vindication of frontier values, the belief that merit matters more than pedigree, that innovation trumps tradition, that the American West can lead rather than merely follow Eastern examples. But the moment that meant most to Eleanor came when James stepped forward to address the gathered crowd. 6 years ago, I placed an advertisement seeking a mature woman for companionship and marriage. I thought I was looking for someone to help, manage a ranch, and share the isolation of frontier life. His voice carried the warmth that had developed between them through shared challenges and mutual respect. Instead, I found a partner who transformed not just my life, but the educational opportunities available to an entire generation of Western children. He paused, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room. Eleanor McKinnon came to Wyoming as a mail-order bride whom others considered too old, too set in her ways, too ordinary to matter. She's become the most important educational innovator in territorial history, proving that wisdom and determination can accomplish what youth and privilege often cannot. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Eleanor felt most moved by the sight of her former students scattered throughout the crowd, young teachers who'd returned to their home communities, agricultural scientists working to improve farming methods, business leaders who'd learned to think systematically about complex problems. The train journey back to Copper Creek provided time for reflection on how completely her life had changed. Since that September day, when she'd first glimpsed the Circle M Ranch from Thomas's wagon, the woman who'd boarded that train in Boston had been seeking security and respectability. The woman returning to Wyoming had found purpose and achievement beyond anything she'd dared imagine. "Do you think we've accomplished what we set out to?" "You do?" James asked, as they watched the familiar landscape roll past their window. "We've accomplished far more than we set out to do," Eleanor replied. "We thought we were building a ranch and a school. Instead, we've created an institution that will influence education for generations. And what about the personal side, the marriage, the partnership we've built?" Eleanor considered the question with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to all important matters. Their relationship had evolved far beyond the practical arrangement they'd originally envisioned. It had become a love story, though not the dramatic romance of novels and poetry. Instead, it was the deep affection of two people who'd chosen each other deliberately and discovered that shared values and mutual respect created a foundation stronger than passion alone. "I love you, James McKinnon," she said simply. "Not the desperate love of youth that burns bright and fades quickly, but the steady love of partnership that grows stronger with time and shared challenges. And I love you, Eleanor McKinnon, for your intelligence, your courage, your refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose, for proving that the best marriages are built on equality and mutual respect." The return to Copper Creek revealed how much their small town had grown and changed. The railroad depot bustled with students arriving for the fall semester, faculty members returning from summer research projects, and visitors coming to observe the educational methods that had gained national attention. The original Main Street had expanded into a proper downtown district, with bookstores, restaurants, and professional services that served the Institute community. But the most dramatic changes were visible at the ranch itself. The Circle M had evolved into something unprecedented, a working cattle operation that also served as a laboratory for agricultural education. Students studied animal husbandry by working with their breeding program, learned range management through hands-on conservation projects, and conducted research that advanced farming techniques throughout the region. "It's exactly what we envisioned," Martha observed as they surveyed the integrated operation from the front porch of the stone house that remained the heart of their enterprise. Education that serves practical needs, innovation that solves real problems. The evening brought a surprise that demonstrated how far their influence had spread. A delegation of educators from Australia arrived unexpectedly, having travelled across 2 oceans to study their methods. The visitors included professors from the University of Sydney and Melbourne, along with government officials responsible for establishing schools in Australia's frontier regions. "Your reputation has reached the far side of the world," explained Dr. Robert Ashworth, the delegation's leader. "We're facing challenges remarkably similar to those you've solved here. How to provide quality education in isolated communities, how to prepare students for lives that require both academic knowledge and practical skills." The week-long visit that followed provided Eleanor with external validation of the Institute's significance. The Australian educators examined every aspect of their operation, from curriculum design to faculty recruitment to the integration of academic and practical instruction. Their enthusiastic endorsement confirmed that the Wyoming model offered solutions to educational challenges faced by frontier societies worldwide. "You've created something unique in the history of education," Dr. Ashworth concluded during his farewell address to the faculty. "This institution proves that innovation can emerge from anywhere when visionary leadership meets practical necessity." As autumn progressed toward winter, Eleanor found herself increasingly focused on ensuring the Institute's long-term sustainability. At 58, she recognized the need to plan for eventual succession while continuing to guide the institution's growth and development. The solution emerged through conversations with her most promising graduates, Dr. Sarah Coleman, who'd earned her teaching certificate from the Institute before completing advanced degrees at the University of Chicago, agreed to return as Associate Director with the understanding that she would eventually assume full leadership responsibilities. Want to create something that will survive and thrive long after I'm gone, Eleanor explained during one of their planning sessions. The principles we've established, individualized instruction, practical applications, integration of academic and vocational training, these ideas are more important than any individual leader. The transition planning provided opportunities to document the educational philosophy that had guided the Institute's development. Eleanor spent her evenings writing detailed descriptions of teaching methods, administrative procedures, and institutional values that would preserve their approach for future generations. December brought an unexpected honor that placed their achievements in historical perspective. The National Education Association invited Eleanor to deliver the keynote address at their annual convention in Washington, D.C., making her the first woman from west of the Mississippi to receive such recognition. The speech she delivered to over 2,000 educators from across America summarized the lessons learned through 6 years of frontier education innovation. We have proven that excellence in education depends not on tradition or prestige, but on understanding student needs and adapting instruction accordingly. We have demonstrated that practical applications enhance rather than diminish academic rigor. Most importantly, we have shown that innovation flourishes when educators are free to experiment, to fail, and to try again. The standing ovation that greeted her conclusion lasted nearly 10 minutes, but the moment that moved her most came afterward, when dozens of teachers approached to share stories of how the Institute's graduates had influenced their own practices and improved educational outcomes in their communities. The journey home from Washington provided time for reflection on the extraordinary arc her life had taken. She thought about the woman who'd answered James's advertisement 6 years earlier, frightened of being judged too old, too ordinary, too set in her ways to start over. That woman had been seeking security. She'd found adventure. That woman had hoped for respectability. She'd achieved distinction, but most importantly, that woman had discovered that society's limitations were merely suggestions rather than absolute truths. Age had brought wisdom rather than decline. Experience had provided insight rather than rigidity. The qualities that others had seen as liabilities, her maturity, her practical focus, her determination to prove herself, had become the foundation for achievements that surpassed anything she'd accomplished in her youth. The train pulled into Copper Creek on Christmas Eve, and Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction of returning home to a life she'd built through courage, intelligence, and partnership. The station platform bustled with students heading home for the holidays, faculty members meeting visiting relatives, and townspeople whose lives had been transformed by the educational opportunities the Institute provided. James waited beside their carriage, his hair now more silver than dark, but his smile as warm as it had been during their first tentative conversations on the ranch house porch. Behind him stood Martha, Thomas, and other longtime friends whose support had made everything possible. As they drove through the snow-covered campus toward the stone house that had become her true home, Eleanor reflected on the mail-order bride, advertisement that had started it all. The widowed rancher had sought wisdom where others saw only wrinkles, partnership where others saw only desperation, potential where others saw only age. He'd found all of that and more. Together, they'd built not just a marriage, but an institution, not just a life, but a legacy that would influence education for generations to come. At 58, Mrs. Eleanor McKinnon had proven that the best chapters of life often began when conventional wisdom suggested the story should be ending. She'd shown that mail-order brides could become educational pioneers, that wisdom mattered more than youth, that partnerships based on mutual respect could accomplish extraordinary things. The woman who'd been considered too old had become exactly the right age to change the world, Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.